When we think of knights, we immediately think of them as wearing armour. But of course armour is hot and heavy and uncomfortable, and unless you're fighting in a battle, it's quite impractical. So what did they wear when they weren't fighting? In the medieval period, up until about 1400, the type of clothes that anybody would wear, depending on their status, weren't that different. The cloth might have been different, but the things they wore were, broadly speaking, the same. So you would have had woolen leggings or hose, you would have had your underpants on, which were made of linen, you would have had an undershirt, and you would have worn wool, a kind of wool coat or a wool tunic over the top. Slight differences in the period, but broadly speaking, you were using as much of the cloth as you could to make the outfit. You weren't that worried about fashion because your status was actually illustrated by the accessories you had, the kind of gilding on your knife and brooches and jewellery, and also the cloth that you had your clothing made out of. I am at the moment in sort of mid-status wool. This is very practical. It wouldn't really be for court use. You might turn up to your local tavern in this. You might work in the fields or do your writing if you're a merchant. It's long-lasting, fairly heavyweight wool. The type of wool varied though. There was expensive wool and cheap wool, as you might have imagined. And the colour of your clothes also sort of gave some indication of your status. The darker and richer colours, broadly speaking, were more expensive because they used up more dye, and the lighter colours and the more easily available colours, which could be hand dyed rather than specialist dye shops, were the cheaper colours. So you could tell instantly that somebody's status was high, medium or low from the colours they were wearing and the type of cloth, but not necessarily from how they looked or the sort of arrangement of the clothes. This is a modern reproduction of something we see in illustrations from Hans Memling, which is about 1450, 1430s, 1440s. And it has a very bold pomegranate pattern on it. And this is not made with gold, but the original would have been made with gold thread. But this is a modern material, but it shows you the luster and complexity of the type of fabrics that were available. And fabrics were coming from far away. And we know this because there is a lot of evidence of Vikings, for example, Viking burials having Islamic writing on their silks, or even, in some cases, what looks like Chinese silks. So there is a huge and significant trade in clothing material passing from the east to the west along what is known to this day as the Silk Road. The other thing about clothing is that the more fabric you've got, the wealthier you are, because fabric costs and materials cost more proportionately than people's time in making the clothing. So if you have very full clothing, you're also very wealthy. So big sleeves were an important component of it. And for women's clothing, big voluminous dresses were the way to go. And having them very long, so that they're actually longer and they rubbed on the ground, was completely familiar to people. But of course, people wouldn't necessarily wear their best kit for ordinary, everyday endeavours. So the posh fabric might have just been brought out to meet the king or meet the local nobility, or for special occasions, much like it is done today. The Silk Road brought expensive cloth from east to west, but it also brought disaster in the shape of disease. The plague swept through Western Europe and decimated the population, and that brought with it change. And change and rebuilding society was a big driver for changes in fashion. In fact, it's at this moment that we notice that cut of cloth and fashions start to come in. People start to show off more. Shoes start to become incredibly pointy. People start to have incredibly ornate platform heels when they can afford it. And so fashion starts to really get hold of things more than types of cloth. So the cut of sleeves, the type of hat you were wearing, all these things were sort of, in many ways, powered by changes in society. People wanted to move on from the past, and change brings with it innovation, and innovation is represented by different types of clothing, different types of fashion. In some ways, you could say that the fashion industry was born out of the disaster of the Great Plague. There have been periods in history where very high status people dressed up as low status people, and there's a fantastic series of stories. This one in particular, one of the kings of France attended a masquerade ball covered in tar and feathers to represent a wild man of the hills along with some of his friends. One of his relatives came in with a flaming brand, and while these crazy figures were capering and pretending to be wild men of the woods, he peered too closely and set them on fire. And many people died as a result of that. The king was actually spared because he was smothered by the grand skirt of one of the great ladies of the court. But basically, they dressed up as wild men, and some of them were burnt to death as a result of it. Around this period in history, various sumptuary laws were brought in. Sumptuary laws are simply things that say what you can wear because of who you are. And if you wear the wrong kind of material or the wrong kind of colour, then you could be fined by the authorities, and you have to pay money and you have to take those clothes off and get rid of them. What it in fact meant was that you could show off even more, because if you were of middle status and you wanted to wear really posh cloth, well, you knew you had to pay a fine, get away with it. It just proved you were more wealthy. So in many ways, the sumptuary laws were an attempt to slow down change in society by reactionary forces who didn't really like the speed of change. But of course, like most laws trying to stop human nature, they didn't last for very long and were widely ridiculed even at the time. We sometimes look at medieval clothing and kind of laugh, and it's a bit silly, and they have silly hats and they have silly shoes and stuff. But of course, fashion back then was very serious. This is what everybody was used to. And yet, look at what we wear sometimes. You look at the outfits that we wear today, and they're uncomfortable, and the shoes don't fit very well, and the clothes don't keep us warm. And you think, maybe they weren't as silly as we think, maybe we're as silly as they were. But humanity doesn't change. Humanity likes to cover itself in cloth to keep warm, to show status, and basically to show off. Thanks for watching. Please like and subscribe. Don't forget that notification button. And we hopefully will see you next time when we are looking at more interesting medieval topics.